Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks with the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially by scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar is joining me today. Tina Wei is a PhD candidate at Harvard University. Tina, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
So my dissertation is about the history of fatigue in the workplace in the first half of the 20th century in the US.
Mm-hmm. And are you coming at this from, I know you're in the Department of History of Science, and so are you coming at this from sort of a workplace medicine perspective, or what is your approach here?
Yeah, the dissertation, as you mentioned, I'm in the history of science program. And so in terms of the history of science, my work draws on some history of medicine because some of the people I'm looking at are doctors, physicians at an industrial plant or something like that. Some of them are psychologists, some of them are psychiatrists. So they're MDs, but specifically focusing on psychiatry, and some work on ergonomics. And so there are a lot of different kind of subdisciplines of science under the umbrella of the human sciences that get brought to bear on the project. And the dissertation is divided into three parts. So in the first part, I focus on a physiological approach to fatigue, those who were studying fatigue as a condition that's primarily located in the body. And then the second part of the dissertation looks at people with a hybrid conception of maybe kind of mind-body conception of fatigue that incorporates both mental and physiological fatigue. And then the final section looks at people who are making the argument that fatigue is primarily or exclusively a mental problem. And so when workers are coming with complaints about accidents or material conditions, raise wages, cut hours, improve conditions in the workplace, that there's actually a mental problem going on, and that the solution to that, the solution to a mental problem should be a mental solution. So that's kind of the way I go about approaching it. But in terms of the scholarship I've drawn, I guess there's some history of science, some labor history, and then some business history, because a lot of the places where some of these studies are happening are all sorts of different businesses. Some of them are in industrial plants. Some of them look at kind of casual labor and agricultural labor or mining. Some of them look at office work, some look at housework, but businesses are a very important part of a lot of the people I'm studying. So those are kind of the three big buckets that I'm drawing from.
Wow, that sounds like a really interesting project.
Yeah.
What attracted you to the subject?
I don't know if you want the longer version or the shorter version, but I'll try to kind of sum it up. So when I was an
Okay.
undergraduate, I majored in philosophy, and I loved studying philosophy. But I think there was something I was looking for in terms of something that was closer to my life, or closer to maybe like a present day significance. Not that I need that like exclusively, but yeah, there was just something that I felt like I was missing from my philosophy education, although I really benefited from and am deeply influenced by that kind of training. So after my bachelor's degree, I ended up working in people operations at Google. So that's the department at Google that they renamed human resources into people operations,
I
essentially.
see.
And in working there and in living in Silicon Valley, in the mid-teens. So it's different from the kind of climate or landscape now. After the pandemic, they've scaled back a lot of the workplace benefits. And then I don't know if you've been following, both last year and this year, there have been like hundreds and thousands of workers laid off in tech. And so now it's a different kind of landscape. But when I was working there in the mid-teens, that was kind of the peak, the heyday of those types of that style of workplace benefits, with a huge emphasis on wellness, construed in a certain way. And so in being in that kind of environment, first of all, in being in living and working in Silicon Valley, I became interested in these questions of science and society that really animate the discipline of the history of science or science and technology. I guess STS is defined in two ways. Some people call it science, technology, and society. Some people call it science and technology studies. And so that's kind of what got me interested in that subdiscipline. And in terms of the specific research question, working in kind of like a department that's a descendant of HR, I was interested in how did we get here? Why are these workplace benefits structured in this way? Why do they emphasize the values that they do? Why is it that the corporation can justify spending so much money on these things? And how does that relate to workplace productivity or whatever other objectives the corporation has? So in getting into that, I got into this kind of like these historical questions about how we got here. And then that eventually led me to what I'm doing now.
Sure. So where does fatigue come into the picture? Were some of the interventions in the workplace at Google tailored to counter the effects of workplace fatigue, or is that some part of the observation you made coming from the workplace?
Yeah, so throughout, I try to use the word or the term industrial fatigue because that's
Hmm.
the term that my I guess historical actors use.
Hmm.
And a lot a lot of the physiologists would always refer to it as industrial fatigue. And then later, as people try to take apart the physiological view of fatigue, they start just referring to it as fatigue. And then eventually people use different terms. And so I tried to center my study on that because some of the people that I focus on, especially towards the beginning of the dissertation, that's the animating term for
Hmm.
that. And I don't know how much I'll get into it in terms of the dissertation, but this kind of condition of workplace something looks different if you call it fatigue versus burnout versus stress versus anxiety versus neurasthenia. And
Hmm.
so you could you could tell different stories or trace different etiologies based on how you demarcate this concern and how broadly or narrowly you go. But I guess I decided to go with industrial fatigue because some of the people I look at, they specifically term their study the study of industrial fatigue.
So are the subjects then primarily the industrial labor force?
For those people, yes. And so some of the questions that they ask, especially the physiologists, are if there's this furnace, it's dry heat, 110 degrees. The worker goes in there, spends 10 minutes in there, and they have to repeat this every hour and a half. How many times can they do this before they collapse? And so a lot of this research is operating under the paradigm of the human worker as a machine. And
Hmm.
so these scientists would make all of these analogies of just as you do upkeep for a mechanical machine in an industrial factory, you ought to do that for the worker as well. And just as a mechanical machine can reach a point where it just breaks down and can no longer do the work you demand of it, the human worker can be pushed pretty far, but their argument is that there is this kind of like threshold where you push them past that point and they break, so to speak, as a mechanical entity that you're demanding work from.
Hmm.
And so they rely on this analogy a lot, but it's within that kind of framework that some of the initial physiological research comes about.
It sounds a little bit like this is heavily influenced by Taylorism. They're sort of doing time motion studies, but from a sort of health and safety perspective. Am I
Yeah.
catching that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. So the second part of my dissertation focuses on Taylor, maybe not so much Taylor, but all of the people around him, and then
Mhm.
the second generation of Taylorites. And I have a couple chapters focused on the work of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. So the mother and father portrayed in Cheaper by the Dozen, and they themselves were efficiency consultants. So some of the work that I focus on that happened during Frank Gilbert's lifetime, and then he died, and then that work kind of stops, has to do with motion study done with the camera. And so using the camera as a way to kind of make concrete or tangible or trace movement or motion as a way, as an entry point into fatigue. And so they called that research project, the couple called this research project, their fatigue elimination project for a while. And so that's another place where this fatigue key term comes back.
Wow.
And they have this, the way they think about it, sometimes disparagingly, is how do you eliminate waste in industry?
Mm,
And so sometimes people can be waste as well. And so they did work on disabled veterans. And so part of this, it's this I don't know, it's like a triumphant progressive era belief that there's this kind of technocratic solution to all of these social problems, and that some people are a waste in that they can't participate in society or the economy at the same level of being a producer. And that when they do this motion study and they fix the workplace setup, you can kind of rehabilitate these people to become producers again. And so yeah, it's a very fraught kind of discourse in terms of what's considered waste, how do you eliminate waste or fatigue in industry in a variety of workers.
mhm. What kind of workplaces are you looking at?
So the first part of the dissertation, and for that first part, I'd drawn the materials from the National Industrial Conference Board, which where the papers are at the Hagley.
Mhm.
They get into this like spat with some of the scientists I'm looking at, and they start producing their own like counter research on fatigue
Really?
because some of the researchers were involved with these kind of welfare movements, and they wanted to use the research to make arguments, for example, for shortening the workday. And then the National Industrial Conference Board kind of marshaled evidence in the contrary direction to say all this fatigue, all your fatigue statistics are wrong, and you should look at it in the way that we look at it. And so it becomes this whole kind of there's a lot of spilled ink over it. And that's what led me into the Hagley
Mm.
collection. So those people, the ones that I'm looking at in that kind of dispute, they look at two companies. One is Ford, and so the auto industry, and the other one is the Scoville Manufacturing Company, which is like a metal and brass company in Waterbury, Connecticut.
Mhm.
So those are the industries I look at for that section. And then when I get into the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth stuff, they really diversify the industries they look at. So some of them are looking at typists, like he was
Mm.
looking at these champion typists, or through working with him, he claims that they became international typing champions because he eliminated all the fatigue. And so some of that is office work. So they have a specific kind of desk set up to look at office, the motions involved in doing office work. And then Lillian Gilbreth gets into kind of homemakers labor. And so how do you design a kitchen in order to optimally arrange everything so you can, as she would say, like make an apple pie in like 10 steps. Or she's credited with lots of innovations you might be familiar with today, like the foot pedal trash can, or having shelves and refrigerators. So this kind of like home kitchen centric labor, and how do
Mhm.
you eliminate fatigue wherever possible in that kind of setup. And then in the final section of the dissertation, some of these social scientists are looking at kind of like radical militant union activity
Mm.
out west. And so some of them are in mining and agricultural labor. So some of them call them California casuals, so casual labor within the agricultural sector in California. And they're often like itinerant labor, and they might move from one job to another, and they're focusing on those types of workers. And then the last thing maybe I'll say is I don't know how much I'm going to emphasize this or how I'm going to string it together in a narrative fashion, but all of these people, or most of these people I'm looking at, are scientists. They're like either like academic research scientists affiliated with the university, or they're kind of engineering consultants, or they are doctors. So they're scientists of different stripes, and there is a kind of theme throughout all of this where they're either explicitly or implicitly aware that doing scientific research is also a form of work. And so
Mm.
they generate a lot of kind of like self-conscious meta discourse about how, oh, I'm doing this committee work and that's really, I'm really fatigued from this. Or they make jokes about it.
Mm.
And one of them, Frank Gilbreth, studies some laboratory scientists. So looking at the motions involved in like pipetting something and surgeons. And they were really involved in kind of standardizing the order in which you put surgical instruments
Uh-huh.
in order to cut down on the time that the patient would have to be under anesthesia, which at the time could have posed various hazards. And so there was a medical efficiency movement that they dovetailed with. So there are all these ways in which there's the workplace that they work on, but then they themselves are doing a type of work. And sometimes that's brought into the research as another workplace that they're concerned with.
What a rich subject.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your use of the materials in the Hagley collections. Could you perhaps let us know how Hagley came on your radar and then what sort of collections you've gotten into?
Yeah, I think I heard about the Hagley from going to the BHC, the Business
Mhm.
History Conference. And so a lot of people recommended that I go there. And a number of my friends had also gone there, particularly Aaron Van Nest, who studies fisheries, and he was in my department. And so
Mhm.
Aaron, in particular, recommended it not only for the research experience, which is super cool, but also, getting to stay. I don't know what you guys call it, the campus or the compound. Like, it's just
Mhm.
it's super cool. And the like gunpowder demonstrations, it's a whole kind of experience
Yeah,
on
sure.
top of a regular research trip. And I just thought that was so cool to be able to experience that. Yeah, so it was it. And my friend Alex Perry also went there and he also highly recommended it. Yeah, it's just kind of this like all inclusive experience. And I had a really great time going on all the tours and stuff because
Mhm.
the workers' quarters and I write about work. And so it's kind of it felt very related. But in terms of the topic or the academic research
Mhm.
path that led me there. I think it was hearing about it from other people at BHC, and they recommended that I check out the collections. And then I found that this organization I was trying to find kind of paper trail for, that the entire collection is at the Hagley. But it's really interesting about that collection. It's super extensive. I forget. I don't want to get this wrong, but I want to say there's like 110 boxes or something. There was a lot, but the finding aid's not digitized. And so it doesn't seem like people work on this particular collection that much, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the finding is digitized or not. But it's just like, it's a super extensive collection. And they have all sorts of material, including transcripts of meetings. And for later periods, I learned from Angela, one of the librarians, that there are also audio recordings, which are super cool. But yeah, there was so much stuff that I found there. I'm not quite sure yet how I'm gonna distill it down into something that is I can communicate to another person outside of
Mhm.
my own head. But there was so much material, and it took quite some time to even orient myself to the layout of how the materials are organized.
Mhm.
And so I'm glad that I had a couple weeks there to work on this. And I think I'll try to come back in the spring. But it was a really, really cool collection to immerse myself in.
When you were in the collection, was there a particular document or source that really made the light bulb go off for you?
Yeah. So I'm not sure how I'm going to bring it together with the rest of the materials in my dissertation yet, but I've been thinking about this document for a while, ever since I found it in the archive.
Mhm.
Um, so there's this theme throughout a lot of people that I'm looking at in terms of their relationship with fascism. So I don't know what to make of that, or like it doesn't seem like on the surface that fascism needs to have any kind of relationship with fatigue. I don't know. But I found in their documents that in 1929 they invited this fascist to come speak at their meetings, because I wasn't really sure about the kind of status of the National Industrial Conference Board in general. Because
Mhm.
on the one hand, I guess way later on, they published like the Consumer Confidence Index, and like economists cite them. Like the economists I know at my university, like they cite them like they're just a regular organization that puts out research. They're not aware of this like 100 years ago
Mhm.
um, history of how the foundation of this organization may relate to a response to the labor movement. And that's like today, that's not really how they're read at all. And it seems to me like they're read as this super neutral body. So I'm not sure how to piece it together in terms of, but then from my union sources, even in like the 40s and 50s, I see them refer to the National Industrial Conference Board as the brain trust of the capitalists. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, like what's the status of the science that they're putting out? I'm not quite sure how I'll deal with that per se.
Mhm.
But yeah, they invited this fascist to come speak, and they had an interpreter and everything, and then they distributed the speech to all of their kind of like member associations.
Mhm.
And right before it, they printed this preamble or preface that was like, by printing and distributing this, we are neither claiming to support or deny the contents of this talk.
Mhm.
And so it just, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know. It just seemed to me like that was a really interesting statement. Not only were they saying not we don't endorse this, they're saying we don't endorse this, nor do we claim to not endorse it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, but that
Yeah.
that seemed to me like just a super interesting find that I wasn't planning on encountering.
Sure. Yeah, that these studies have some political valence to them, especially given the context of labor relations in that moment. That is so fascinating. Would you say that your study has any implications for the present moment?
Um, mm, I don't know. You mean in terms of how labor and employers should interact, or how we should see fatigue in the present day, or something
Well, I
else?
suppose to if I interpret your main thrust of your main point correctly, that these sort of measures of addressing workplace fatigue also amount to a form of labor control and discipline. And I'm wondering whether at this moment we have
Hmm.
presently where there is a lot of union organizing and a lot of industrial agitation, as it would have been called 100 years ago, whether your study speaks to that present moment in some way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that is interesting to me, I'm not sure if this is as like concrete and applied as I could articulate it, but it's like the people I'm looking at, they lived in a period where when they say labor militancy, they mean like very serious violence, and a kind that we don't necessarily see today. But
Mhm.
in that kind of against that kind of backdrop, some of these psychiatrists were looking at the social situation, and they would come out with these statements that unionism, as they call it, or Bolshevism, is a form of insanity. And so that's how they kind of interpreted it. I think you're totally right that the broad arc of the dissertation, as I see it, is that I'm trying to show how this concern for workers' health, which started out as kind of this like welfarist, progressive era, pro-worker
Mhm.
engagement, then became a tool for capital to better command its workforce,
Mhm.
exactly as you said. Um, Something that I've noticed that why I think this kind of reprisal is particularly interesting at this moment is that, as I may have mentioned, some of the arc I'm trying to draw out is that people started out seeing it as a physiological thing, and then later on, people made the argument that it's just a mental problem. And I feel like we're living in an age in which people now see that maybe the physiological is coming back in a way where it hadn't been emphasized as much before,
Hmm.
or maybe purely mental solutions offered by the workplace, like a mindfulness meditation program, is not sufficient to meet the challenges, the other types of challenges or changes that people are calling for in the workplace.
Mhm.
So that might be one aspect of it that the way it bears on the present is that I'm interested to see how a conception of fatigue that incorporates both the mental and physiological aspect might change the way we think about work today and the types of demands that people make on the workplace. And I guess even more broadly, a consideration of how science interacts with labor, because that's constantly happening throughout my dissertation. Like scientists are intervening in the labor problem and sometimes posing themselves as a neutral third party arbiter of this social conflict. And we're living in a different moment in terms of how science intervenes on the labor question, if at all, or maybe it'll change or pivot the direction that the labor movement will go. Yeah, because a lot of the workers I'm looking at talk about the indignity of being watched, like having
Hmm.
time
Mhm.
study or motion study, or these researchers come into the workplace, that there's something objectionable about that. But today, scientific tools mediate a lot of people's workplace experience through surveillance or other means. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, some kind of um, reflection about the longer arc of science and labor, science as a form of labor control or science as a mediator of labor control may also be part of the present day relevance.
Mhm. Well, Tina, that's really thoughtful, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's been fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me and for chatting.
Oh, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.